Good evening, everyone, and a very warm welcome to you all to this event tonight to celebrate the 265th birthday of Scotland's Bard, Robert Burns. Tonight we have an audience of around 250, so some people are still coming in just now, but I just wanted to let you know that you've come together from Paisley to Warsaw, so such a wide range of folk. And my name's Amina Shah. I'm the National Librarian and the Chief Exec of the National Library of Scotland. And tonight we've got a really special event which brings staff from across the National Library and the Mitchell Library in Glasgow to talk about Robert Burns and also to show you some of the original manuscripts that we have within our collections. And the way that we're able to do that is by using visualizers that we have in both our reading rooms. And this is the first time that we've done an event like this. We've done lots of Zoom events online throughout COVID and beyond. And we do, of course, loads of in-person events where people come to the reading rooms and libraries. And recently we've been doing lots of events using the visualizers with individuals and groups, but we've never done one in this way before. So we're really excited to bring something different to you tonight. So without further ado, I'm just going to pass you over to our rare books curator, Robert Betteridge.
Okay, hello everyone, and thank you very much, Amina. Yep, I'm Robert Betteridge. I'm the curator for 18th century printed books at the National Library of Scotland. And I'm actually going to stop my video now so that you all have a better view of the text. So we're going to have a look at the public personas that Burns promotes in his first two publications. So the first two collections of Burns's work were published under the title Poems Chiefly in the Scottish Dialect. The first was printed by John Wilson at Kilmarnock in 1786, and the second by William Creech at Edinburgh in 1787. These are often referred to as the Kilmarnock edition and the Edinburgh edition. Later editions would follow, but the core of Burns's poetic work, which made him famous, appears in these first two editions. The Kilmarnock edition begins with a preface, and the Edinburgh edition with a dedication, but both serve a similar purpose and allow Burns to craft personas that he wished to promote to his readers, and particularly for the Kilmarnock edition, the context in which the poems should be read. The cost of producing both these editions was covered by subscribers who agreed to purchase a copy of the book in advance of publication, more or less what we might refer to today as crowdfunding. And this gave Burns a certain amount of freedom in choosing what he would write. There were three particular personas that Burns wished to promote: that of a ploughman poet of relatively humble background, that of an independent man not bound to a patron or producing his poetry for financial gain, and that of Scotland's bard. So let's see how he does this with a closer look at the preface of the Kilmarnock edition. Burns's opening words of the preface to the Kilmarnock edition establish the first of these personas. It's one by which he's widely remembered today, the ploughman poet. He begins, "The following trifles are not the production of the poet who, with all the advantages of learned art, and perhaps amid the elegancies and idleness of upper life, looks down for a rural theme, with an eye to Theocritus or Virgil." In this and the following text, he's establishing that he's not a member of the gentry or an aristocrat, as many poets were, didn't have a classical education, meaning he wasn't taught to read Greek and Latin through studying the poets, orators, and historians of ancient Greece and Rome. He's not a gentleman who has to look below his social standing to imagine a rural life. He's living it in his day-to-day existence. He cites pastoral classical poets, which he wasn't taught to read and write in their native language. However, he has enough education to cite them and know that they were the leading pastoral poets of Greece and Rome. And by pastoral poets, we mean those who deal with the relationship between humans and nature. So Burns clearly comes into this category. Rather than understanding Latin and Greek, Burns emphasises that he writes much of his poetry in his native language, Scots. And all this emphasises the genuineness of his poetry, and the lack of a formal education emphasises his innate talent as a poet. In playing down his education, Burns is not being quite honest with us. His father arranged for a tutor, John Murdoch, to teach Burns, his brother Gilbert, and other local children. And Burns educated himself by reading. After all, he knows Virgil and Theocritus and much more besides. However, this persona played well when he came to be introduced into society in Edinburgh, and is typified by Henry Mackenzie's review of the Kilmarnock edition, in which he described Burns as this heaven-taught ploughman. Burns continues, though a rhymer from his earliest years, and begins a passage showing he was encouraged into print by his friends. And of course, conviviality is so important for Burns. And he continues over the page to suggest the following works were not composed with a view to the press, but written to amuse himself with the little creations of his own fancy, and in line with the ploughman poet persona amid the toil and fatigues of a laborious life. Burns is often cited as an influence on the emerging Romantic movement, and what follows very much speaks to that, as Burns writes of his loves, griefs, hopes, fears, and struggles against a world that doesn't care, in which he can escape through poetry. Rather than being inspired by the Enlightenment ideals of intellect and reason, or the epic poetry of the classical world, Romanticism emphasized individualism, emotion, celebration of the past, and a deeper relationship with nature, the latter a particularly strong trait of Burns. So Burns is projecting something of the tortured poet here, and we know he went through periods of depression. He writes into a mouse about his fears for the future. And he doesn't focus on literary or social conventions as an influence on his poetry, but rather his emotions and connections to his place of birth and its people. And in the next paragraph, Burns appears to display some nerves at the prospect of having his work judged by the public, but is perhaps a little tongue-in-cheek. Here he describes himself as a bard, which I'll come back to shortly. At the bottom of the page, there's a mention of Shenstone, that is William Shenstone, 1714 to 1763, an English pastoral poet, an influence on Burns. At the top of the next page, we see him quoting Shenstone, who wrote, "Humility has depressed many a genius to a hermit, but never raised one to fame," which gives Burns some justification for his entering into publication, though he's careful not to suggest he himself is a genius. However, he knows he's good, and we can sense some confidence here. His use of the word genius can also be associated with a romantic sensibility. Genius is innate, something that cannot be taught. In the middle of the page, he introduces some of the context of how his poetry should be read by noting two of his major influences. To the genius or Ramsay, or the glorious dawnings of the poor unfortunate Ferguson, he, with equal unaffected sincerity, declares that even in his highest pulse of vanity, he has not the most distant pretensions. By Ramsay and Ferguson, he means Allan Ramsay, 1686 to 1758, and Robert Ferguson, 1750 to 1774, referred to as unfortunate as he died in an Edinburgh hospital aged just 24. There's some persona building going on here too. Burns is positioning himself alongside Ramsay and Ferguson, who we think of today as the three leading Scots poets of the 18th century. Following this, Burns finally gets around to thanking his subscribers, those who made publication of the book possible. But his thanks are not the mercenary bow over a counter, but the heart-throbbing gratitude of the bard. Here he's promoting his independence and the persona of Scotland's bard. He's not some servile shopkeeper taking money for his wares. It's more of an equal trade. He gets the support of his readers and they get his poetry. So what does he mean when he promotes the persona of the bard? Traditionally in Celtic culture, a bard is a teller of tales or writer of poetry or song. For example, attached to the household of a clan chief, where the bard might commemorate a person or event in return for payment. The bard could also fulfill the role of preserving the tales and culture of that society. This persona appealed to Burns, perhaps inspired by the Tales of Ossian, the supposed 3rd century bard produced by James Macpherson in the 1760s. Following the publication of the first 2 editions of his poems, Burns spent more time collecting and preserving Scots songs, as can be seen from his contributions to James Johnston's Scots Musical Museum and George Thompson's select collection of original Scots airs, to which he preserved many old Scots songs, sometimes with his own additions, and to which he also contributed original pieces. He lived up to his independent persona by not making any money from these contributions. Over the page, and in closing, he comes back to how he started, with a reminder of his education and circumstances. This book was aimed at what nowadays we would refer to as a middle-class audience, and his ploughman poet persona can distance him from criticism. If he claims not to know the proper forms for writing poetry, how can he be blamed for not following them? His supposed lack of education in the rules of poetry, the inspiration of his rustic peers, and placing himself as a poetic descendant and preserver of the style of Ramsay and Ferguson play into the Scotland's bard persona, protector of his nation's language and cultural heritage. So following the success of the Kilmarnock edition, Burns went to Edinburgh to pursue publication of a 2nd edition, which was published in an edition of 3,000 copies in April 1787. This too was paid for by subscription. Under the influence of the Earl of Glencairn, around 100 members of the Caledonian Hunt subscribed, as well as many others. They were a club of rural gentry who organised sporting and social events, and Burns couldn't ignore this contribution by leading members of society, so he dedicated this edition to them. Now, if we turn from the title page of the dedication, we find the supremely confident Burns, writing in a style more suited to a formal dedication. He gives away much less of himself than he does in the Kilmarnock edition, but having tasted the success that publication brought him, the dedication brims with not just confidence, but independence, as Burns fully takes on the persona of Scotland's bard. There's almost a sense that Burns is saying Scotland is lucky to have him. He begins a Scottish bard, proud of the name, and whose highest ambition is to sing in his country's service. So he's laying claim to his independence by placing himself as Scotland's bard and not someone in the service of an individual patron. But, minding his manners, he flatters the Caledonian Hunt by suggesting its members are virtuous patriots who would naturally support a national bard. Over the page, Burns continues his ploughman poet persona, but in a much more poetic manner than in the Kilmarnock edition. The poetic genius of my country has inspired him rather than what he experienced amid the toil and fatigues of a laborious life, as described in the Kilmarnock edition. Rather than laying claim to any personal genius, he conjures up a divine destiny to be Scotland's bard. As he did with both public and private personas, Burns is tailoring his language to his audience. In the next paragraph, while noting his debt to his subscribers, Burns in one phrase sums up the main personas he wishes to present in his introductory texts. I was bred to the plough and am independent. Such a bold statement made in the confines of the hierarchy of 18th century society was not to everybody's taste and points to the radicalism that Burns would be associated with in the 1790s. It also shows that Burns knows he will remain a farmer, doesn't expect to make a living from his poetry. On the next page, Burns begins winding up the dedication with more typical flattery and good wishes for his subscribers. For all that Burns maintains his independence, he had a genuine respect for the Earl of Glencairn, who had done so much to help him and was deeply affected by the Earl's death in 1791. He could also, when required, actively court patrons such as Robert Graham of Fintry when in pursuit of a position with the excise. And turning to the final page of the dedication, he signs off in what was typical language of the time as your most devoted and humble servant, Robert Burns. And now I'll hand over to Susan at the Mitchell Library in Glasgow.
Hello everyone, happy Burns Night. Thank you, Robert. The most interesting items I work with at the Mitchell Library are personal letters. They are usually not written to be made public, so reading them always makes me feel like I'm doing something I shouldn't, as well as giving me a sense of being inside the mind of the writer. Now, their great strength is their potential to reveal aspects of the writer's character that may not be publicly stated, often communicating intimate thoughts and frank opinions. And the letter I'm going to talk about is from the Mitchell Library's Cowie collection. It was part of the collection of East India merchant William Rennie Cowie and inherited by his son John, and then donated to the library by John's widow Elizabeth. Now, in terms of its physical features, I hope you can see the marks of folds, because it was cheaper to send a single sheet of paper. A writer would fold up his letter and tuck in its corners to serve as its own envelope. And I think you can just see that some of the wax seal survives. It is written in Burns's distinctive, large, clear hand. And you can just see to the left the addressee and the address, Mr. William Nicol, Master of the High School, Edinburgh. You can see the postmark also, indicating that it was sent by Burns from Carlisle. So, to what extent does this letter from Robert Burns to Willie Nicol reveal the persona of Robert Burns? Some of you may already be familiar with this letter, but for the benefit of those who aren't, and in order to get a full and proper sense of it, here it is, read out loud, in the appropriate Ayrshire accent by my colleague, Claire Thompson.
Mr. William Nicol, Master of the High School, Edinburgh, Carlisle, 1st June, 1787. Kind honest hearted Willie, I'm sitting down here after 47 miles riding, e'en is for Jesket and for Nowid is a for Focht and Cock, to gie you some notion of my landlouper like Stravagan, sin the sorrowful hour that I shook hands and parted with old Reekie. My old god glide o' a mare has huckled up in Doonbrae, in Scotland and England, as cheuch and burnie as a very devil wi' me. It's true, she's as poor as a sang-maker, and as hard as a kirk, and tipper tapers when she taks the first gate like a lady's gentlewoman, in a minuet or a hen on a het girdle. But she's a yowld, poothery girdin for all that, and has a stomach like Willie Stalker's mare that would have digested tumbler wheels, for she'll whip me off 5 stimperts of the best dates at a down sitting and ne'er fash her thumb. When yins her ringbanes and spavies, her crooks and cramps are fairly supple, she beats too, and I the hindmost hour the tichtest. I could wager a price to a 30 pennies that for 2 or 3 weeks riding at 50 mile a day, the deal sticket a 5 gallopers a quiche, Clyde and Whithorn could cost something or two. I had on a devoured the country for Dunbar to Selcraig, and he forgathered with money a good fella and money a wheel fort hizzy. I met with 2 dinquines in particular, ane of them a sonsy, fine fodgel lass, baith braw and bonny. The t'other was a clean-shanked, straight, tight, wheel fort wench, as blithe as a lin white and a fleury thorn, and as sweet and modest as a new blonde plum rose in a hazel shawl. They were baith bred to manors by the book, and ony ane of them has a muckle smedum and rumble gumption as the half of some presbyteries that you and I baith ken. They played such a devil o' a shavey that I dare say, if my harrigals were turned out, you would see 2 nicks of the heart of me, like the mark of a kale whittle in a cassock. I was going to write you a lang passel, but God forgive me, I got myself sae notoriously bitchified the day after kale time that I can hardly stoter button ben. My best respects to the good wife, and all our common friends, especially Mr. and Mrs. Cruikshank, and the honest good man of Jock's Lodge. I'll be in Dumfries the morn, if the beast be to the fore and the branks bide hail. Good be with you, Willie. Amen. Robert Burns.
Thank you, Claire. Well, it's quite a letter, and the only surviving long-form example of Burns writing in his colloquial Ayrshire Scots. As Claire's reading demonstrates, the power of the spoken word is undeniable, and this is particularly true of spoken Scots. The vocabulary is astonishing and tricky to follow if you're not familiar with Scots. In fact, it's the only Burns manuscript in the Mitchell Library for which I have had to prepare a glossary. Now, the letter is simply a summary of Burns's day's travels, describing relatively mundane details, such as his mare, women he has met, and having a hangover. But those mundane details are made interesting by the language used, the expressiveness and energy of pure Scots. Although some of Burns' most celebrated poems were written in the vernacular, he did not usually write his letters in such broad Scots. Helpfully, the letter is dated, although you may have noticed it gives two dates. The first is the actual date of creation, the 1st of June, 1787, which enables us to fit it to the end of Burns's month-long tour of the Borders, which had begun on the 5th of May, when he left Edinburgh on horseback, along with his apprentice lawyer friend, Robert Ainslie. The second date is an odd, imaginary one, the 39th of May. It is, I think, a comic reference to the previous month's tour, having been long and grueling. So thereby he's giving us a clue to his state of mind and body. By the way, if you are interested, you can view further details of the tour at the website of the Centre for Robert Burns Studies at the University of Glasgow. All of Burns' tours were researched and plotted by Nigel Leask as part of his work on the new Oxford edition of the works of Robert Burns, and the accompanying maps have been produced in collaboration with the National Library of Scotland. Now, this letter was written less than a year after the publication of the Kilmarnock edition that had changed Burns's life, and it was only a couple of months after publication of the Edinburgh edition. Burns was coming to terms with his newfound fame and establishing himself as a public figure. He had been able to take advantage of his great aptitude for self-promotion, projecting various public personas. For example, as Robert mentioned previously, the so-called heaven-taught ploughman. And these public personas were designed to fit the expectations of the intended audience, particularly to people of influence. Even personal letters that were meant to remain private offer opportunities to project, whether knowingly or not, how the writer sees himself, a version of self that he wishes others to believe. We can see this in Burns's self-styled Sylvander to Agnes Maclehose's Clorinda, as which characters they corresponded in a very elevated, formulaic manner. Indeed, Burns's letters have been described as literary works in their own right, self-conscious combinations of delicacy and coarseness that enabled him to negotiate the social and literary demands of patrons, lovers, and friends. Of course, Burns met more sympathetic individuals in those egalitarian clubs and houths for lively talk, song, and bawdry. One of the convivial and informal clubs of the day was the Crachallen Fencibles, and they represented the middle ranks of society where Burns felt more comfortable. Burns appreciated and found there people who had a great capacity for life and revelry. The freedom of such clubs must have been a refreshing change from the studied gentility that Burns often had to endure in the drawing rooms of Edinburgh. And it is possible that this is where Burns met Willie Nicol. Both men possessed a lively intellect, were well-read, witty, and excelled in stimulating conversation. So just who was kind, honest-hearted Willie? William Nicol was born in 1746 at Dumbretton in the parish of Annan, Dumfries and Galloway. He studied for the ministry as well as medicine before finding his forte in classical studies. While at university, he supported himself by a tutorial practice and translating theses for students until 1774, when he won an open competition conducted by the Town Council of Edinburgh to fill a vacancy for a classical master in the high school. This gives us a clue as to the purpose of the letter. Burns revelled in and wanted to preserve traditional Scottish culture, and that included the Scots language, which was regarded as being less rigid, more liberating than English. The letter is testimony to the capabilities of language and Burns's skill in using it. Being a classical linguist, Nicol had a great command of language. Therefore, over and above his knowledge of Greek and Latin, it may have been meant as a challenge to Nicol's knowledge of Scots. Although there were around 13 years of age between them, Burns and Nicol resembled each other in some ways, and theirs was a friendship of equals, having both come from humble beginnings in the southwest of Scotland. Burns grew up knowing the vagaries of farming and long days of physical labour, while Nicol's father was a tailor who died in poverty. Both also shared a hatred of hypocrisy and were critical of the establishment. Perhaps then, the letter was meant as a reminder to Nicol of his lowly origins. While the tone of the letter is conversational and spontaneous, there's also an artificiality about it. How much of what it describes actually happened, and how much is invented? As Burns did when he collected and improved songs, did he embellish his experiences a little? Did he fill out fragments and amalgamate sections to create something new? It's tempting to think that Burns was creating scenarios by drawing inspiration from real life as an excuse to make use of particularly expressive Scots words and phrases, such as the wonderful notoriously bitchified. However, there does seem to be some truth to the words of the letter, as they can be cross-referenced with Burns's journal entries, in which he mentions the people, places, and events of the tour. As ever, he did have a number of romantic adventures during this period, and in at least one of those adventures, he admits to having been a little cut with the bottle. So while this letter is artificial, it's not artificial in the sense of Burns trying to portray a particular persona, but rather in the sense that he's using language in an extreme, over-the-top, exaggerated way for comic effect. In this way, the letter is more revealing of his private self. Burns certainly had a great sense of humour, and he admired the same in others. By nature, Burns was earthy, emotional, empathetic, forthright, observant, tolerant, all qualities which enabled him to put up with Nicol, who, although he was warm-hearted to his friends, has been described variously as conceited, curmudgeonly, irascible, sarcastic, savage, uncongenial, and vitriolic. However, Burns admired honesty, the human heart beneath rank and title. He said once, "I can look on a worthless fellow of a duke with unqualified contempt and can regard an honest scavenger with sincere respect." Burns also once wrote fondly about a relative who was one of those who love fun, a gill and a punning joke, and have not a bad heart. And he appears to have seen those same qualities in Nicol. There's certainly ample evidence that Burns was very much aware of Nicol's faults and failings, and yet was willing to put up with or even forgive them. Indeed, Burns chose Nicol as his companion on his Northern Highland tour from the 25th of August until the 16th of September that same year of 1787. And the way he bore Nicol's tantrums during this tour is ample testimony to his patience and understanding. Also, Burns named his third son, born on the 9th of April 1791, after Nicol, because of that, as he described it, propensity to witty wickedness and manfu mischief, which even at 2 days old I foresaw would form the striking features of his disposition. Now, while it is difficult to gauge the nature of a relationship from just one letter, the intimacy between Burns and Nicol is revealed in the many letters they exchanged over the years, many of them written in the spirit of playful teasing, mocking each other. For example, in another of his letters to Nicol, Burns commented on the frailty and uncertainty of many of his friendships. Certainly few of them lasted, but his friendship with Nicol, despite all of Nicol's shortcomings, endured through good report and bad report, up to Burns's death in July 1796. Nicol himself died 9 months later. I'd like to finish by pointing out that any estimation of Burns's character will always be limited. His life was, after all, a short one. He was only 37 years of age when he died. That said, this informal letter, written just 10 years before his death, offers insights not really into a public persona, but rather into the true character of Burns, someone who loved both to challenge and to amuse, and perhaps most importantly, someone who delighted in friendship. Thank you. I'd now like to hand over to Ralph McLean, curator of the long 18th century manuscript collections at the National Library of Scotland.
Many thanks for that introduction, Susan. So, as Susan said, I am manuscript curator for the long 18th century, a century so long it includes 1688 up to 1832. And as part of that, I have the privilege to look after the manuscript collection of Robert Burns that we have here at the National Library. Now, rather than do a deep dive into one letter the way that Susan has done with the Willie Neville letter, what I thought I would do is to look at a series of letters, or flashpoints, if you like, of Robert Burns's life, where perhaps he was at a crossroads, and to see what he was saying in those particular letters. And I'm choosing to do this from almost all one collection, which is the Hornersfield collection of Robert Burns's letters. And the library, to cut a very long story short, was fortunate to get 12 of these manuscripts, which were going to be put up for auction by Sotheby's. But thankfully, after a consortium came together, of which the National Library was involved and various other partners, we were able to save those letters for the nation. So what I intend to do is to go through these letters and to pick out sort of key points from Burns's life. And what I'll also do is I'm going to stop my video so that you can see the letters a bit more clearly. So the first letter that we have is an exceptionally important letter because it's the only surviving letter that Robert Burns wrote to his father. It's also one of the earliest letters that we have of Robert Burns. There are only 3 earlier letters that we know of. And this letter was written in 1781 in December to his father. And it's quite a telling letter because he's very honest about both his mental and his physical health. At this point, Burns has moved to Irvine. He's training as a flax dresser, But things are not going very well for him. He thinks that his partner is a kind of a rogue and a scoundrel. He believes that he's a thief. He's not enjoying the flax dressing, but he's also suffering physically as well. He's actually been in bed for a long period of time. His dad has come to visit him. And although it's very dangerous from the perspective of the 21st century, to diagnose sort of the illnesses of Robert Burns, I think it's safe to say that he did have some form of depression. And this very much comes out through the letter. He talks about his health not being what it is, that his nerves are effectively kind of shot to pieces, and this is affecting his mind as well. And if we could just over the page, what we can see hopefully in this is that, so Burns, he's young, he's scrappy, he's hungry, but he feels that he's missing his shot. He's looking for fame, but he feels it's passing him by. And he feels that he's not very much longer for this world. And what he actually says, he refers to his poverty. And he says that, I foresee that very probably poverty and obscurity await me, and I am in some measure prepared and daily preparing to meet and to welcome him. So he's being very candid here. He's speaking to his dad, and he's saying that, effectively, I think that's it for me. And obviously, we know that the story is very different, and that Burns has, well, tremendous literary success. But bear in mind, this is 1781, and things have still to happen at this point. I think the other thing to say is that he did have a bit of a falling out with his father, partly because Burns wanted to learn how to dance, and his dad greatly disapproved of that. And it does look as if in this letter, Burns is trying to kind of sort of mend some bridges, or build some bridges. And he's effectively saying that, he appreciates the instruction that his dad has given to him. And that perhaps again indicates that Burns thinks that, maybe this is it for him. And even years later, when he writes his autobiographical letter to Dr. John Moore, he refers back to this time, and it is seen by Burns as one of his kind of darkest moments. So a very interesting letter and a very candid letter that he sends to his father. So moving on to the next letter that we have, Burns is in a bit more of a celebratory mood. The publication of the Kilmarnock edition has just taken place a month before. And Burns, as far as he's concerned at this point, is on the way out of Scotland. He's going to move to Jamaica, where he's going to become a bookkeeper on a plantation. That is perhaps euphemistic. He would have been working on the plantations as well. And at this point, as I say, he's almost got passage on a boat. This is written on the 30th of August to his friend William Niven. And he's supposed to be leaving for Jamaica on the 1st of September. But obviously, as we know, that did not happen. Now, this letter is not actually part of the Warner Seal collection, but it's a special letter for me because it's the first letter that I was able to partake of in purchasing for the library. And I think it's worth pointing out that all the letters that are on display from the National Library of Scotland that we have today have actually been acquired by the library within the last 5 years. So that's not to say that these have not been published. They are in the letters of Robert Burns, but just to say that we are still actively collecting materials and adding them to our collection as and when they do turn up. You'll see that there's quite a bit of damage to this letter as well. And this letter has been damaged effectively since 1858, when it was first published. There was actually a reference when it was published to say that it was badly damaged, and that effectively we should keep better condition of this material for posterity. And it doesn't seem to have suffered too much degradation since then. But what's Burns actually saying in this letter to Niven? Well, he's talking about the good time that he's had with Niven. They've been out on the Raz effectively. They've been celebrating. And Burns is saying his farewells to various people. At this point, Niven is one of his closest friends. Niven is going to fall out with Burns because Burns wrote an address to a young friend, which Niven thought should have been to him, but was addressed to Andrew Aitken. And Niven didn't forgive Burns for this. We decided in a fit of pique to destroy the letters that Burns had sent him. And in a way, I think this, because it's such a bad quality letter, this one, in the sense of its physical condition, it's probably been the case that because it was separated from the main bulk of letters, that's why it's actually survived. So we're fortunate to have the surviving letter of Burns to Niven. The other thing I kind of alluded to is, like, what is Burns not saying in these letters in the way that he's presenting his persona? I mean, he's talking in kind of friendly terms here to William Niven. But what he's not saying also is that Jean Armour is heavily pregnant and is just about to give birth to twins. And Robert doesn't mention her at all in this letter. And as far as he's concerned at this point, he's leaving Scotland and everything in it behind. But obviously we know that does not happen. And what Burns does is he moves on to Edinburgh. So if you could have a turn of the page, please, for that manuscript. One thing just to draw people's attention to is that he actually says to his friend William Niven, he acts in a kind of coy manner, saying, look, tell people, never blow my songs among the million, and I'd be embarrassed to hear that if every apprentice was mouthing these, my poor performances in the streets. And I don't think this kind of fits with Burns's persona, in the sense that he wants fame and he wants fortune. So he's probably actually delighted that people, even in his locale at this point, have bought copies of these poems and are beginning to repeat them back and to perform them. So Burns himself goes to Edinburgh. He's convinced by others to try for a second edition, as Robert mentioned. And if we could have the next letter, please. This is a letter that Burns sends to John Ballantyne. And Ballantyne was an old patron of Burns from his days in Ayrshire. And if you read Alan Cunningham's version of Robert Burns's visit to Edinburgh, it's a rather jaunty version of Burns sweeping into Edinburgh, going up and down the Royal Mile, travelling round Arthur's Seat. But in actual fact, Burns starts off his letter by basically saying, I came to town with a miserable headache and a stomach complaint. So the reality and myth there is obviously quite stark. But the thing about this letter is Burns is mentioning all the people that he's encountering, all the literati, all the doors that are now starting to be open for him. So Robert mentioned the Caledonian Hunt, and Burns mentions them here in this letter. He's obviously delighted to have met the Earl of Glencairn. And although Robert's right to say that, and as Susan mentioned as well, he's suspicious of those with kind of rank and title to a certain extent, he does seem to have a genuine affection for Glencairn and is very happy with his association with him. Over the page of this letter, Burns also mentions a series of people that he's meeting and getting to know in Edinburgh while he's there. So he mentions the Duchess of Gordon, who has a tie in a sense to Willie Nicol that Susan mentioned in her talk, because irascible indeed, when Willie Nicol and Robert Burns were on that tour, they were asked to stop in at the Duke and Duchess of Gordon, and because Willie Nicol didn't get an invite and Burns did, he simply took his horse and went to the next place, and Burns felt that he couldn't leave him and had to turn down the invitation, which obviously caused a bit of bad blood. But while he's in Edinburgh, the Duchess of Gordon is a fan of his work. He also mentions a few key members of the literati, some members of the Scottish Enlightenment, Professor Dugald Stewart, Hugh Blair, who's Professor of Rhetoric and Belles Lettres at this point, which is effectively the first chair in English literature. And Blair's an interesting figure because he is one of the proponents or claims as the kind of great supporters of James Macpherson in the discovery of the Ossianic poetry. And because he's got this reputation as a literary critic, he wants to insert himself into the world of Burns, and he's quite happy to suggest ways that Burns can improve his poetry by passing him various suggestions. And to be fair, Burns sidesteps most of this, but he does actually change a couple of his poems in order to accommodate Blair's criticisms. And the third person that was mentioned was Mr. Mackenzie, and that's Henry Mackenzie, who wrote The Man of Feeling. It's a book that's faded somewhat, but at the time Burns described it as a book I prized next to the Bible. And so he was delighted to meet these people, but to keep them somewhat at arm's length, in the sense of they're trying to alter, to interfere in his poetry, and Burns wants to keep a bit of distance on that. So we could have the next letter, please. So this is a letter which is written a few months after Burns is in Edinburgh. It's written to Frances Dunlop. Frances Dunlop is one of the key figures that Burns writes to. She's in terms of surviving Burns letters, it's the largest amount of letters that Burns wrote to a single person that still survive. She got in touch with him shortly after reading the Kilmarnock edition, and they kept up a correspondence which went up right up until almost Burns's death. And you can see here that Burns is getting a bit antsy about the people that are suggesting ways in which he can improve his poems. So he talks about the criticisms that Frances Dunlop has offered him, and he's rejecting them. And if we could turn the page on this letter. To go back to what Robert and both Susan were saying, it's like Burns himself feels that he's got to Edinburgh and he's achieved what he's achieved on his talent, but he's very unhappy about people just based on pure rank and title that are being afforded the same kind of popularity or engagement, if you like. And so Burns is very clear that he doesn't care a bar for the way that critics are responding to his poetry, and he's going to try as much as possible to keep them away. Now, skipping on to near the end of Burns's life, if we could have the next letter, please. So this is quite a sad letter. This is written in 1795 to William Stewart. And as Burns starts, he says, "This is a painful, disagreeable letter, and the first of the kind that I ever wrote." And basically, unfortunately, Burns is writing and asking for money because of his large family, because of the fact that he never took payment for writing all the Scots songs that he contributed, which he could have done, and the fact that he's not getting quite the level of promotions in the excise which he's hoping for. All of this means that he's not getting enough money to support his family properly. And unfortunately, this is the kind of sad reality that Burns is having to adopt this persona and to ask for money. And what we have at the bottom actually is William Stewart responding and saying, I gave 3 and 3 to Burns to sort of tide him over a bit. So I don't want to finish off on a sad note. I'd rather finish off on a happy and more positive note. So I could have the next item. One of the poems that we received as part of the allocation for the Hornersfield collection was a poem on Cessnock Banks. And we wanted to acquire this one for the library because it is an early version or an early song of Burns from 1780, roughly. We don't know who the actual lassie is. It's been suggested that Alison Begbie is that person, but possibly not. But after Sotheby's, who had taken in the collection, after we decided who would get what songs, Sotheby's got in touch with us and said, well, actually, we found something on the back of this that you may be interested in. And if I could have that image, please. As you'll see, it's a version of Auld Lang Syne. So we got a lovely Auld Lang Syne bonus. And I think that's quite a good place to leave a talk on Burns with a surprise Auld Lang Syne ending. And without further ado, I believe that we have 10 minutes left for questions. So if people have their questions we'll do our best to answer them.
Okay, thank you very much to our panelists for the really interesting talks. We do have a few minutes now for Q&A. So if you do have any questions for any of the panelists, then please put your questions into the Q&A option at the bottom, and we will get to them if we can. We do have one, and this is to Susan from Sue. She has asked whether you can repeat the place mentioned where you can find the details of Burns Border Trip.
Yes, no problem at all. That is part of the website of University of Glasgow Centre for Robert Burns Studies. Now, I've pasted the link there in a response, Hazel. I wonder if I should paste that somewhere else for others to see. Should I put that in the main chat, perhaps?
If you send me the link, I can put it into the answer to the Q&A.
Sure. Okay. I can do that.
We can sort that out and we can send that answer out.
Yes, no problem at all.
Okay. We have another question here from John, and this is to Ralph. So does the version of Auld Lang Syne that we've just shown, does that differ from the known version?
Yes, it does. Unfortunately, it doesn't have the first verse, which everyone would associate with Auld Lang Syne and can probably sort of recite off the top of their head. Possibly the reason for this is that Burns maybe had it locked down already. So it was working on another part of the song. So we have the title of Auld Lang Syne. There's no major changes other than, say, the omission of that first verse. There's a few differences in terms of like where commas are placed and the spellings of individual words, but there's no sort of changes or new verses. There is a kind of an odd thing that he does, is that he swaps a couple of lines around in some of the verses as well. But again, those lines are in extant versions of manuscript. So sadly, not a completely new or revamped version of Auld Lang Syne.
Okay, we have another question here from Julie, and she says, why are you not wearing gloves when handling the letters and manuscripts?
I can answer that one, Hazel.
Okay.
These days, the thinking tends to be actually that wearing those traditional white gloves, particularly, can actually affect dexterity negatively. So, because it feels a little unnatural, like any kind of glove wearing, there's a tendency for you to not be as dexterous as normal and perhaps rip a page, particularly a manuscript that's as delicate as these ones are. So we tend not to use white gloves, certainly at the Mitchell Library, and unless we're handling something like photographs where there's a bit more easy transfer of sort of grease from hands to the photographic plate or what have you. But usually we rely on clean, dry hands, and that seems to preserve the manuscript well.
Thank you, Susan. We now have a question about, again, the manuscript letters. So from Erica, has asked, have the letters from the Burns collections been digitised? And if so, are they available on your website?
Yes, happy to say that they are. All the material that we acquired as part of the Hornersfield Library have been digitised. They're available on the National Library of Scotland's digital online gallery. There's a whole section for Robert Burns, so you'll find the first commonplace book of Robert Burns. All of the letters except for the William Niven letter that I referenced have been digitised and are available on that as well. And I believe that a copy of the Kilmarnock edition is also a part of that digitisation as well.
Susan, do you want to comment from the Mitchell?
Oh, yes. Now, many of our Burns manuscripts have been digitised, but they are not necessarily available on our websites as yet. So no, that's something we would hope to do in the future, but we have certainly digitised them for ease of access within the library, but that's something we certainly need to pay attention to in the future.
Okay, thank you. The next question is from Craig, and he's asked, is it possible to visit the library and view these letters in person?
Yes, from the National Library's point of view, all of the letters that I've referenced and talked about tonight, anyone is welcome to come and view them in our special collections reading room in the library, as long as you've got a clean pair of hands to turn the pages, and a reader's card, which you can obtain, then yes, these are all publicly accessible.
Absolutely. And for the Mitchell Library too, this manuscript I was talking about tonight, and any manuscript, any item from our special collections are viewable by the public. We prefer it if you made an appointment in advance, and membership of the library is not an essential part of that, but we do ask for people to bring along photographic identification with them, and to, as I say, to book in advance if possible. Just give us a call.
And just to say, at the very end of this event, there will be a slide which will have the contact email addresses for both of the libraries. So if you do want to get in touch with us, you can do so. We have a question here from Linda. So she says, do we know much about Burns's children? I don't know if any of you know any of that. That might be something that we might need to think about and come back to.
I know there are several books about, the genealogical aspects of Burns. The family tree of Burns. I know that one joined the military. I think he ended up living in Cheltenham of all places. But no, I'd have to check and look them up to give you exact details. Oh, I tell a lie. There was a daughter, Betty Burns. Betty Burns came to live in the south side of Glasgow. She married a weaver, John Thompson, I believe. Is that right, Ralph? Do you remember?
No,
Does that ring any bells? We have a picture, I think, of Betty Burns on our Glasgow Story website, and Betty Burns's grave is somewhere in the south side of Glasgow. I know that much.
Okay, thank you. We have another question here from Vicky, who has said, it was a wonderful session. Do you find something new or a fresh insight every time you approach the letters or poems? So that's to all of the panel.
I suppose there's always something new to be discovered. There's also, it doesn't happen very often, but sometimes you get things like new letters emerge of Robert Burns as well, and that fits into the story and it offers a new insight or a new angle, or fills in another blank. We know that there's lots and lots of letters of Robert Burns that people have seen in the past, but they've disappeared from public viewing. We don't know where they may be. We're hopeful that they may turn up in the future. There's letters that have been destroyed as well, so there's gaps that are missing, and we're always hopeful that they turn up as well. So anything like that obviously offers a direct insight into Burns and his world. But there's so many collections that we have at the library that you can even find out things about Robert Burns that are not necessarily a letter of Robert Burns. So for example, you can have letters where people are referring to Robert Burns or they've interacted with him in some way. So there's always new discoveries to be made, and colleagues at the University of Glasgow that are working on editing Robert Burns for the 21st century have done lots of work in this area and are turning up new things all the time. So I think this was referenced just yesterday in an event that the University of Glasgow had. He's died over 200 years ago, but we're still finding out so much about him even now, because there's still so much out there.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So I think we've got time for one last question. And I'm not sure whether you'll be able to answer this or not, but somebody has asked, did Burns see and approve of the portraits of himself in his books?
I do know that he was more of a fan of John Bwago's etching of him than the Naismith portrait, as far as I'm aware. I think there's a letter where he references that. So at least he will have seen that and liked that. But that's about as much as I know about that.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much. So this now concludes our event. I'd like to say thank you to all of our panel for all their interesting talks. I'd also like to thank the backroom staff as well for making this actually possible and for using the visualizers to demonstrate the material. And I'd also like to thank everybody who attended and submitted questions. If there's things that you really want to know or you want to know more about the collections, then please get in touch with us and we will get back to you as quickly as we can. So thank you very much and good night to everybody.